Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our Critical Minerals for Electric Vehicles Addressing Extraction Concerns webinar. This is being hosted by the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments Policy and Advocacy Committee. My name is Millie Elia, and I am the Program Manager of Climate and Clean Energy Advocacy for the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments. And today's webinar will be recorded, except for the Q&A portion. And we will be sending out to all those who have registered the opportunity to fill out a post-test question for 1 hour of nursing CEs. Now, just a little bit more housekeeping. The evaluation and CE link, along with any resources shared by our presenters, will be again sent out only to those who registered. Please be sure to put your questions in the chat. There will be time for Q&A portion after our speaker's presentation. And I am very happy and pleased to announce our speaker for today. And just a little bit about her. We have Jordan Brin, who advocates for light, medium, and heavy duty vehicle transportation, electrification regulations that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and pollution burdens. She focuses on electric vehicle battery supply chains and charging infrastructure. Bryn holds a bachelor's degree in environmental systems engineering and a master's degree in civil and environmental engineering from Stanford University. She is based in the NRDC's New York office. Welcome, Jordan. Thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Yes, thank you for having me. Excited to talk to you guys about the intersection of EV batteries and supply chains and minerals, all that good stuff. So share some slides, and then like Millie said, we'll have some time for a Q&A, I hope, at the end. So thank you for the introduction. Yeah, I'm here. So my name is Jordan. I'm here on behalf of NRDC, where I sit on our transportation team. And today I'm in my capacity as I've been trying to figure out how we can engage on the battery supply chain space and make sure that EVs are as sustainable as possible. So just to level set a bit at the top of our conversation, transportation is the most polluting sector in the US, which you may or may not already know. And when I say polluting, I mean both in terms of climate pollutants, so like causing global warming, and then also particulate matter and other health harming smog and pollutants that we breathe in on the ground. And then this increases diseases, and especially childhood asthma, and shortens lifespans. Oil extraction is also dirty and dangerous too. And we want to electrify these vehicles because it can help clean up our air and create healthier and safer communities. So, a couple years ago, I put out a report called Building Batteries Better, and in it, I wanted to examine what all goes into making batteries that are in EVs. What are the types of minerals and processes and materials? What are potential impacts we can see from that? And then how do we make sure that these systems are sustainable as possible? So I'll just give a little bit of background about electric vehicles and the minerals that go into making them. So EVs are powered by batteries. Today, that's typically a lithium ion battery, and those tend to have a few different minerals in them. They tend to have graphite, lithium, and then some combination of nickel, cobalt, and manganese. You may have heard of this term critical minerals. It's a federal government term. It's actually defined by the USGS, and it's a list of 50-ish minerals that are considered critical because of their need either for energy or for defense or something related to the US economy. combined with the fact that their supply chains are challenging, they might be concentrated in certain countries, or have a limited supply in some way. So when I talk about these minerals, I think this is the critical minerals term is what you might see in the media a lot more. We try to be a little more specific about what minerals we're talking about. You may hear the term transition minerals. That just refers to this specific handful of minerals that we need for clean energy technologies, like batteries for EVs, like solar panels, which is about 11 minerals total. Just so we make sure we're talking about specifically what we need and not this big list of 50 things. But that's the term that media tends to use on this topic. The fact that EV batteries use minerals rather than gasoline is good because when you put gasoline in a car, you burn it up, it goes away, it goes into the atmosphere. But with minerals, when you're ready to retire your EV, you can actually reuse the minerals again. You can recycle the battery, get those minerals out, and put them in a new battery. So it's still a little reliant on extraction, but once you get it out of the ground, you can keep using it again and again. It doesn't just get burnt into the atmosphere. So this is an overview of the supply chain for EV batteries. So we were just talking about minerals. So from top to bottom here, you have to do exploration to identify mineral deposits. You have to mine and get the minerals out of the ground. And then you have to process those materials to make sure they're good enough to put into batteries. And then that's when you start making these battery components and packaging them together to make the big battery packs that go into electric vehicles. And then ultimately, at the end of the vehicle's life, we hope that the batteries and minerals are being recycled, and I'll talk a little bit more about how we can ensure that's actually happening. Another thing I just wanted to cover here at the top is that I feel I get this question a lot about, oh, well, are EVs even like actually cleaner than gas cars? Like we have to get minerals for batteries, we have to make the batteries, like even over their life cycle, are they cleaner? And the answer is yes, they definitely still are. On the screen, I just have a study by the Union of Concerned Scientists. They did a comparison of the total emissions over the lifetime of gasoline cars versus EVs. And EVs still have about 50% less emissions than gasoline cars, even though that little blue bar represents like the increased emissions that it starts out with because of the greenhouse gases produced during the mining of minerals, during the processing and making of the battery. What is good about EVs too is that they get cleaner as they drive and as our grid gets cleaner. So for gasoline power car, if you buy a gasoline power car and it gets 30 miles to the gallon, it's going to get 30 miles per gallon for its entire life. But if you get an EV, and it gets 100 miles per gallon equivalent, the more renewables, solar, wind, and other things we're adding to our grid, it could end its life getting 150 miles per gallon equivalent as our grid gets cleaner. And if you had like a whole really cool setup in your house and you plugged in your EV to your battery pack that was charged with your solar panels, this whole gray bar on the screen would go away. You would have zero emissions associated with driving your vehicle. So I think that's pretty cool and just something to keep in mind when people start to ask, like, is this really good? It is good from a greenhouse gas and global warming emissions perspective. So a bit of a roadmap for the rest of the conversation on the mineral extraction and recycling pieces. So basically we need to reduce impacts from mining, and we need to reduce the need for mining in the first place. So we're going to need some mines to get these minerals that we need for electrification, but there's a lot of things that we can do to improve waste management, get better extraction technologies, and improve community engagement to reduce the impacts of that mining. And then the least wasteful and polluting mine is a mine that was never built in the first place. We can limit impacts, but the best thing is to not build it ever. So what we can also do is reduce the amount of materials that we need to get in the first place. That way we can less mines. So I'll go a bit into some of the challenges with mining now, and then some of the ways that we can improve it. So impacts of mining. Mining has implications for land and water usage and contamination. during the process of mining, you might have to dig up a lot of dirt and arid forests and things to get the amount of minerals that you need. And you might also need to evaporate water or use water to process and extract those minerals. This can lead to a lot of waste that's left behind in tailings. You're usually leaving behind a lot of just random rock and things that you don't need because the percentage of the actual mineral that's in there is pretty small. Um, some of the implications here too are with mining siting. So sometimes when you see these, like especially more controversial mines, they can be near a particularly sensitive ecosystem or maybe near a piece of land that is culturally important to a tribe nearby, something like that. So we want to make sure we're putting mines in places that aren't particularly sensitive or important. And then on the international side, you can see some human rights complications with mining and minerals trade. The Transition Minerals Tracker is a great resource online if you're looking more into those issues. So basically, there's some inherent issues with the mining industry, and we want to make sure that when we're electrifying transportation, we're not just shifting impacts from one thing to another thing. We want to make sure that we're not going to ever have like a perfect system, but just make sure that we're reducing those impacts as much as possible. And I think there's an opportunity here. The mining industry's been very dirty for a very long time. And it's been getting recent attention through dependence from EVs and other clean energy technologies on this mining industry that's been dirty. And so I think this is like a unique moment to actually make a lot of strides on improving mining that advocates and activists have been trying to get done for a long time. So some things that policy things that we can get done to improve mining. So there's some really low-hanging fruit out there because the legislation that governs mining federally in this country is from 1872. So that's over 150 years old. It's in desperate need of an update. A few key things are prioritizing land for other uses besides mining being the most important use, requiring consent, community engagement, and improving environmental standards. The Clean Energy Minerals Reform Act is an act that's been introduced several times in both the Senate and the House that doesn't address everything, but addresses a lot of these issues and would modernize this law and bring it into this century. So that's a really important thing to do on the legislative side. There's also federal grants and national labs that are improving and researching extraction methods, especially in together with universities. They're trying to improve the methods for how we actually extract things so we can create less waste and also even recover minerals from existing mine waste. There's a lot of old mines in this country that have piles of waste that when back from when we weren't as efficient with mining, so there might still be some minerals in there. So there's a lot of people looking into how can we reharvest that waste, get more minerals from it, and then as a result, make it cleaner and less bad for the environment around it. There's also some great examples of community contracts between companies and then local communities, tribes, and indigenous groups. A good example of this is the Good Neighbor Agreement in Montana. And then I think another thing we can think about is predetermined and better siting of mines. So this sort of smart from the start approach. So the idea here being, let's look at all the places we have mineral resources and let's identify areas where they're not as ecologically sensitive, they're not on important tribal or community resources or water resources, and say, let's try to aim for mining here and not in these other areas. Then another thing you get to is addressing the real permitting issue. I think this is another problem that gets a lot of attention. And the real issue here is the lack of staffing at agencies can make it take a really long time to get a mine permitted. But often what gets blamed is the environmental requirements when really that's not the problem and we definitely still need those. So addressing the real problem there. And then there's ways that the US can leverage their power as a purchaser of minerals to improve environmental and human rights standards outside of the US. An example of this is through requirements attached to critical minerals, like trade agreements that the US has with other countries. And then there's some voluntary standards out there that already exist, such as IRMA, that again, we would rather see these things codified in laws and regulations and trade agreements, but companies can volunteer to be certified and at least try to start improving their best practices on a voluntary basis right now. Okay, so now that I've gone a bit over the mining and extraction piece and how we can improve that through policy, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we can reduce the need for mining in the first place. So, pretty classic reduce, reuse, recycle narrative of being more sustainable. Um, so how I think about this is sort of this chart on the left where we think we need so many minerals to get to a fully electric transportation system. But if we use different tactics such as better technology, more recycling, and even needing less cars in the first place, we can kind of start to take that projection downward. So on the first piece of this reduced piece, there's a lot of new battery chemistries and improvements on existing ones that can limit the need for minerals. For example, there's been a lot of improvements in a certain lithium ion chemistry called LFP, and it doesn't need cobalt or nickel, which are two of the harder minerals to get that can be a little bit more environmentally sensitive and in other countries. So improving those chemistries can make sure we reduce reliance on certain minerals. And then there's other new battery chemistries too, like sodium ion, and some of those are popping up in more in the energy storage sector on like the grid side of the equation. But improving or reducing the amount of minerals we need there can just reduce the overall amount that we're needing to decarbonize and electrify everything. There's also research being done to remove things like PFAS from battery binders and packaging materials. I know PFAS, I feel like, is a hot topic in environmental and toxics in human health right now. It's in a lot of things, and so it's good that people are looking into making sure this is removed from batteries. And then we can also improve manufacturing efficiency. So if there's waste during manufacturing, trying to reduce it and making sure it's recycled when there is waste. On the reuse side, EVs are typically retired when their batteries reach about 70 or 80% of their capacity. As you might know from just having a phone or a laptop, like over time, your battery just doesn't perform as well. And so maybe it's no longer appropriate for a passenger car that you want to go over 200 miles before charging. But that doesn't mean it can't be used in maybe a capacity where you don't need that many mileage, like a forklift, or they can actually be, a lot of people are researching how to remanufacture these batteries and use them in things like energy storage for the grid or to accompany with a charging station to help power it. This also just reduces the life cycle emissions associated with that battery just because you're spreading it out over more years and you're not having to make one battery for an EV and then one battery for grid storage. You're using that same battery. So it helps just extend the life cycle. And then the last part is recycling. So recovering minerals from old batteries, once they're finally done, we can get those out, reprocess them, and then use them back in new batteries again so that you're not having to mine as many new minerals to put in that new battery. There's a lot of new companies and labs that are working to scale processes that can recover up to 95% of the minerals. So this really is the key enabler to building a circular economy around our transportation system. So instead of our current system, which requires constant inputs of extracted oil, we can eventually get to a point with electric vehicles where we're really not extracting that many more things. We're continuing to use what we have. So here are some policy enablers on this side of making sure that we're reusing and recycling everything. Right now, there are a lot of programs that exist through the bipartisan infrastructure law for research and development and for scaling new mineral processing and recycling facilities. There's also been some funding for the EPA to develop voluntary battery labeling guidelines. Labeling batteries is really important so that so if it's like taken out of a car and then it gets to a recycler, they know what kind of battery that is and what's in it, and they can process it accordingly. And similarly, state of health information so that you can plug a tool into it and get a read on what is currently going well with the battery, what might be broken, and get a current sense of its status. And actually, the Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulation that requires sales of electric vehicles in several states today has some of these requirements in there. Also, EPA and DOT are already regulating batteries through their hazardous waste regulations. And the Inflation Reduction Act provides some tax credits to build battery manufacturing and recycling facilities at a bigger commercial scale. So some next steps we need to take are there are several state producer responsibility and waste management plans that are being played out at the state level right now. The idea with the producer responsibility is that the automaker and the battery manufacturer, they make this vehicle and then someone uses it for like 10 or more years. And we want to make sure that that doesn't just end up somewhere on a site. And we want to make sure the battery actually gets back to a recycler. So it's basically assigning that responsibility to the original producer of the battery that, hey, you have to play a role in making sure this gets back to a recycler. And so New Jersey already has some waste management plan requirements. And then there are currently bills that have been introduced in New Mexico, Washington, and California as well to try to set up this system. Another thing we can look forward to potentially is recycled content standards. So basically saying in new batteries, you need to require a certain percentage of minerals that are from a recycled resource rather than a mined resource. And that can increase over time to make sure that demand is there to encourage recycling. And then we want to make sure we're continuing grant funding for research through the Department of Energy with their renewal of funds, the Energy Act, and through national labs as well. So this last piece I want to talk about that does connect to mineral demand is having more efficient cars and a better transportation system. So the more efficient our cars are, the less minerals they need. So kind of similar to a gas car. If it gets a higher miles per gallon, it needs less gas. If you have a lighter vehicle, the farther it can go with both less electricity and also a smaller battery, which means less mineral use. So a trend that we've been seeing across the board in the United States is that people are buying larger and larger cars. Demand for your classic sedan, their smaller car, has gone down. And this is really because car manufacturers and automakers want you to buy bigger cars because they make more money. So this is kind of a trend that we're seeing now in the efficiency of vehicles from a fossil fuel perspective, and that we're also seeing play out in the battery space. So we want to make sure people are choosing the right size of car and then that's appropriately incentivized. And then also, if we have our communities that have resources that are more accessible via transit, walking, and biking, then it's easier to get around two different resources without a car. So if a household that usually would need to own two cars can now just own one car because they can do their daily errands without a car and just want a car for those occasional longer trips to the doctor's office across the city or a road trip on the weekend. They just need one car for that. So that's less cars, which is less minerals. A study actually found that the potential range for reduction of just the lithium demand could be 18 to 66% by 2050 if we were all using more efficient vehicles and being able to get around more without driving. So some enablers here are just making sure that we're incentivizing or requiring more efficient vehicles. The jury's a bit out on exactly how to do this. There's emission standards, safety standards, and some different levers we can pull. And then on the more walkable and transitable communities piece, there's ways to shift federal funding formulas and state funding to fund more transit and biking and walking and less highway expansion. And then there's land use reforms like zoning laws, and then also carrots like faster permitting, reduced fees, increased height for if people are building more dense transit-oriented and mixed-use development, so people can access their day-to-day resources without a car. And then there's car share models that can plug in needed gaps like Zipcar Turo. And there's actually a great example of a public and subsidized car sharing program called EV in Minnesota that really improved transit access to a low income community and has a really high utilization. And it's all electric. So it's really cool. But check that out. Okay, just to conclude before we get into some Q&A, the idea here is that we're trying to get away from our current fossil fuel system to EVs to make sure we're both mitigating the worst impacts of climate change while improving health and quality of life in our communities, especially those that live close to these pollution centers, rail yards and highways and ports. Electrification will also reduce environmental impacts and economic impacts associated with oil extraction. But U.S. decision makers must adopt and implement policies to make sure we're reducing harms from mining and actually building a circular economy for EVs so that we're limiting impacts from battery supply chains and also protecting the communities that we're trying to protect by electrifying in the first place. So with that, I'll go ahead and stop. I feel like I've been talking for a while, and hopefully we can get into some questions.
Thank you so much, Jordan. And Tom, I do see your hand up. I just wanted to ask, just spend a little bit of still presentation time, asking just a few questions to continue the dialogue with Jordan. Um, please do save your questions. I will be coming back to that. Jordan, what is it like to work on resource extraction while trying to improve it? So that's more of a perspective, maybe more of a personal question to you, but maybe you can draw us a picture of what that's like.
Yeah, I think, it's a little bit of a tricky it's a bit of a sensitive topic. Like, I feel since I'm working in the transportation electrification space, a lot of my colleagues are all in electric vehicles, like we totally should be. At the same time, I think we do need to acknowledge there are places where they're not perfect and try to talk about it in like a more nuanced, or being able to acknowledge that the system that we're pushing for is not perfect and there are many steps that we should take to make it better. Um, and yeah, I think there's a few tricky issues like this in the environmental community right now. There can be some conflict, there can be some tension between like the system level work and the on the ground work, or project specific work versus federal policy work. So it's, it can be really tricky, and sometimes I'm not totally sure like what the 100% right answer is, but I also know that if we like don't dive into these sticky issues, that we're not going to actually get the result we want. And the goals that the like North Star goal that we're trying to get to with transportation electrification. So, it's a little bit dirtier of a job, but I'm glad I'm working on it, and I'm glad that I have colleagues that are working on the land use and the mining aspects a little bit more as well, because that's, like I said, an issue that's been around for over a century. So there's some much needed progress that needs to be made there.
Totally. And what is a current challenge to electrifying transit and building better supply chains? If you had to really highlight one key, I mean, there are multiple, but
Yeah, definitely a few. I think one thing where we're at right now is just the narrative that we're seeing play out, especially in the media within the environmental community. So, I think I'll go into, so narrative being the first challenge, I'll go into like two examples. I think one is that you see them latch onto this idea that it takes so long to permit a mine, it takes 15 plus years. That means we need less environmental requirements and less community engagement so that we can get this done faster. And there's a lot built into those statistics and a lot of skewedness. And so what I really think we need to present there is more case studies of examples where, hey, what the actual problem is, and I alluded to this a bit earlier, the actual problem is lack of staffing, and a lot of times on the mining company side as well. And it's not actually the environmental requirements that are the problem. Um, and then also more case studies of examples where actually, if you engage the community early and you create benefits agreements, it's actually much faster to permit because people often feel like they're more engaged in the project and they feel like it's something that could benefit them and they can see that in some way. So I think just getting more of that new narrative out there. And then on the other side, or like another example of that narrative, is I think I see a lot in the media, and I've talked to a lot of reporters where they just want to write the story that, oh, EVs are actually bad. Like that's kind of the clickbait headline. EVs are bad for the environment. Mining is bad. Got you, like surprise. And I wish that we could just talk about that in a little more nuanced way of acknowledging that, like, yes, it's not perfect, but we're doing a lot, and there's a lot that we can and should be doing to make sure that we're improving that. And we know that we're not going to ever have a zero impact system, but we're trying to make it better. And just like continue beyond the conversation of this sort of clickbait headline. So that's what I'm trying to be put out there more. I know it's not the most fun, like quick article to read, but I think that's a challenge that I see, and relates to a lot of the questions I get.
no, that's an excellent point, definitely. Um, And where would you say that are we with battery recycling now? And what are some of the solutions that you might suggest to overcome our challenges to really get into that widespread recycling?
Yeah, I think we're at a couple of issues. We're at a point where we know that we'll need to have recycling within the next few years and to start to scale these facilities at a commercial level. But we don't want to overbuild too early. There's not the economic impetus for that because um, EVs that have been on the road for around 10 years are just now retiring and are just now creating that like feedstock for recycling plants. So there's this kind of delicate issue of like, we want to make sure we get the policy landscape and the incentive and research landscape set up so that we're ready to go when we start seeing more and more end of life vehicles. And we don't have this issue sort of like with solar panels where people were like, oh no, like, what do we do with these? So we want to make sure we have that system set up and are prepared for it without like building facilities out too early, but are just planning that investment and that research. Um, yeah, and we want to make sure that also the facility level emissions and worker safety and everything, and that they're good and high quality jobs here in the U.S. I think that's a big issue that's really important today.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this one, this next question is a little bit of a more uh, broad speaking one in terms of actual bills that are current in Congress. But can you let us know any insight you might have on what's happening with the three bills that I'm about to talk to you about regarding critical mineral policy that's working in groups around bipartisan bills. And so the first one is the Earth Sciences and Cooperation Enhancement Act of 2024. Um, the second one is the amendment to the Export Reform Control Act of 2018. And the third one is the Critical Minerals Workforce Enhancement Act.
Yeah, that's a good question. There is a lot of action happening around battery supply chains at the federal level right now. And I think a lot of it is coming out of this sort of more I'll say protectionist and also like just domestic narrative of we want to have more of these domestic manufacturing jobs. We want to build things here. And that is the context that a lot of these bills are being passed in. And the idea is to like basically to mine more here, to have more processing and manufacturing jobs here, and to make sure they're not going to where the what the US government would see as like a foreign adversary. So while I think that that issue is important in terms of having the battery supply chain benefit the US from like a jobs and economic perspective, a lot of the bipartisan bills we've seen so far don't address quite the like environmental and health priorities that we would want to see, and that's some of the stuff I kind of generally talked about today. Although some folks are amenable to at least looking at the recycling side as it does relate to sort of the domestic piece. So yeah, that's what we're seeing come out today. Uh, it can be yeah, it can be a little bit tricky with some of the defense narratives and things. But we can find definitely some room to compromise or to like to align on a couple of the priorities that where there might be some overlap from the environmental space.
Totally. I appreciate your taking the time to answer that.